Welcome to Trowbridge, the county town of Wiltshire. Located in the heart of the lush countryside of southwest England, Trowbridge is a pocket of historic industry that's home to a wealth of heritage and fascinating landmarks, from an eye-catching town hall to a striking parish church, as well as a sprawling marketplace that was once the site of a medieval castle. And all of these landmarks hold the keys to many fascinating stories of Trowbridge's history, from its role as a secret hub of manufacturing in the Second World War to its unlikely links with North Korea, and its historically prosperous cloth-making industry, an industry which even earned Trowbridge the nickname Manchester of the West. We'll explain the history behind that nickname and the rest of Trowbridge's most famous landmarks as we make our way around the town centre over the next 20 minutes. But we begin our walk beside the bridge which is thought to lend the town of Trowbridge its name. Built back in 1777, this stone bridge is the newest in a series of structures crossing the River Biss roughly at this point. However, the very first bridge, built over 1,000 years ago in the Anglo-Saxon period, was made of wood, and it was known as the Trowbridge, literally meaning tree bridge. Now this is the most commonly held theory as to the origins of Trowbridge's name, although it's not the only one. Others suggest that the name derives not from a tree bridge, but the bridge that was located near Trowell, a small hamlet just under a mile away from the modern town centre of Trowbridge. Today this river crossing is known locally as the Town Bridge, and although it was indeed originally built nearly 250 years ago in 1777, it's been restored and even widened on a number of occasions since, as it's continued to serve as the main way into the very centre of Trowbridge for those arriving from the west, originally people entering the town by horse and carriage, and today by motorcar. But changes in transportation methods over time aren't the only ones to have taken place in Trowbridge since this bridge was built over the Biss. This 11-mile-long river flowing through the town may have appeared ideal for the mills that took the town's cloth-making industry to prosperity, but the fact of the matter is that both as a power source for mills and a way of transporting goods in and out of the town, the Biss has always proved too small. So instead, Trowbridge was forced to pivot towards a new man-made canal, the Kennet and Avon Canal, on the other side of town, and it proved more than adequate in supplying the town with power and a route to export its goods. We'll talk more about that canal later on, but here beside the bridge over the Biss, there stands a curious little building that's today one of the most recognisable landmarks in town. This is the Blind House, originally built in 1757 without any windows, earning it the nickname Blind House. Inside, you'll find 2 jail cells, as the building was used as a lock-up for local ne'er-do-wells, troublemakers and criminals during a time when Trowbridge had no police station or prison of its own, with some inmates simply staying overnight after they'd enjoyed too lively a night at one of the local pubs, and some being housed here before being taken away to court in the much larger city of Salisbury. But just along the river from the Blind House is another notable landmark, the large mid-19th century brick building we can see just up ahead on the right, known as Handel House. With its distinctive perforated exterior, Handel House served an important role as the venue for drying teasel and raising the nap of locally produced cloth, and it's actually thought to be the last surviving building in Britain once used for such a purpose. But what exactly do we mean by drying teasel and raising the nap? Well, these are 2 important steps in the cloth-making process. Teasel is a type of plant that was plentiful in the waters of the River Biss, and when dried, it was commonly used as a kind of brush or comb for cleaning fabrics that were produced in the town's mills. Teasel was also used to brush newly manufactured cloth as part of a process known as raising the nap, where the plant's bristles brought up the fuzzy layer on top of the cloth known as the nap, and then the nap was trimmed before the textile could be fully completed and sent off to be sold. There were of course many more steps involved in the local cloth-making process, but it goes to show that Trowbridge was a town perfectly prepared for the rapid growth of textile production that occurred across Britain as the Industrial Revolution began to set in during the 18th century. And just a short distance up the hill from the river, we can see just a few of the fruits of the textile industry that came to dominate life in this town for decades. A row of grand townhouses known as the Parade. Built for the town's wealthiest cloth merchants, the Parade is generally regarded as the most splendid collection of Georgian-era buildings in Trowbridge, most built in 1730 as the local industry really began to kick into gear. Now, of course, cloth making had been taking place here for a long time even beforehand, since at least the 14th century. And just here, we find a house that, despite its appearance, was built long before the Industrial Revolution. The house that juts out into the road here may feature a fetching facade that was designed in 1700, but it merely covers a much older timber-framed house behind it, which was originally built more than 400 years ago in the 16th century. It originally belonged to a clothier of the age named Edward Langford, who was rather interestingly the great-great-grandfather of Queen Mary II and Queen Anne. But his old house was later redesigned to fit in with the elegant style of architecture that came to dominate Trowbridge's streets in the 18th century, neighboured by yet more immense Georgian-era residences built for textile tycoons, like the one we see here, which is now home to the town's branch of Lloyd's Bank. The grandeur of these houses shows us just how prosperous the cloth-making industry was in this town, particularly during the 18th century. But we must also wonder what Trowbridge's town centre looked like before they were built. Here, we find ourselves at the junction of Fore Street and Castle Street. And long before the town's modern shops or even the Georgian townhouses were built, this was the site of Trowbridge Castle, a moderately sized medieval fortress likely built around 1,000 years ago in the early 11th century. There are only a few scattered remains of the castle to be found today, however, as it likely fell into ruin sometime around the 16th century. But when it did exist, it was just outside the castle's main gate, roughly here, that a large marketplace began to develop, and that certainly does still exist today. Trowbridge's marketplace is thought to have begun life around the year 1200, and it was historically a bustling point in the town, frequented by people from all over the surrounding countryside, where a street market selling goods of all kinds existed for more than 600 years. The last regular street market in Trowbridge took place in 1862, after which point a purpose-built market hall took over as the main venue of local commerce. And we'll get a closer look at that market hall on the other side of the marketplace in a few minutes' time. However, hidden away on this corner of the historic town centre trading plaza, we find a narrow alleyway that leads us towards an unspoilt corner of town, home to Trowbridge's eye-catching parish church, the Church of St James. Originally founded around the year 1200 along with the marketplace, St James's Church as we see it today dates mostly from the 14th and 15th centuries, its soaring tower and spire being the oldest parts of the building's exterior. Now, with over 800 years of history under its belt, St James's Church is easily one of the oldest buildings in Trowbridge. But rather surprisingly, it was actually known to locals as the New Church for a large chunk of its lifetime. The reason for that was that this was actually the second major church to be built in the town centre, as before it there once existed an old Anglo-Saxon church roughly beside where the castle stood, and where the modern Shire's shopping centre is today. But as the local population grew on the outskirts of the castle, that original church became far too small for this blossoming market town, and so this rather large new parish church was built just here beside the marketplace. Ever since, St James's Church has been a significant point for the local community, and while much of the building does indeed date from the 14th and 15th centuries as we said, some parts are actually much newer, dating from a restoration in the early Victorian era, and even from as recently as the 1990s, when the top of the church spire was actually blown off in a fierce gale and crashed through the church roof, causing some very severe damage. Since repaired, the spire of St James's continues to dominate Trowbridge's skyline, this being a rather large church which served as a symbol for this town's fast-growing size and significance at the time of its construction. Today, Trowbridge is home to just under 40,000 people, making it the third largest town in Wiltshire behind Swindon and the cathedral city of Salisbury. But around the time of the 15th century, this town stood out as arguably the most economically significant in the whole county. while the buildings around us here serve as a reminder of the prosperity of Trowbridge's 18th century cloth trade, the industry was of course taking place here for a long time before. And it was during the 15th and early 16th centuries, a period sometimes referred to as the clothier's century, that Trowbridge's traditional industry took it to new heights, with locally produced cloth being exported not just around the country, but abroad to France, the Netherlands, and more, as English cloth became highly sought after across Europe. We'll explain exactly how Trowbridge came to be singled out as a hub of cloth making at the time a little bit later on. But the success of the trade also brought great prosperity to the local market, which drew in thousands of people who came to buy and sell goods, but who also needed a place to put their feet up, having made the journey into town. Just here we can see the last remnants of one of Trowbridge's old market taverns, the White Hart, a former pub which was originally built as a wool drying house in the early 18th century, and which is now home to a high street newsagent who've kept the old building in rather good condition since. As a major destination for people from all over southwest Wiltshire, however, central Trowbridge was home to many more pubs than just that. In fact, in the early 20th century there were more than 30 pubs operating on the town streets, a few of which are still open to this day, and which we'll pass by a little later on. However, as we now begin to make our way off the marketplace, in front of us we can see one of the most important buildings in Trowbridge, the eye-catching Town Hall, built in 1889 to celebrate the Golden Jubilee of Queen Victoria. Although constructed a good few decades after the town's modern textile industry had passed its peak, the Town Hall is probably one of the most exquisite buildings in Trowbridge, designed with a soaring clock tower and an ornate stone-built exterior featuring carvings of some of the items that helped this town to prosperity, including a power loom and a railway engine. The building certainly looks the part, and that's because it wasn't just built as an administrative centre for this town, but also for the wider county of Wiltshire. As we mentioned at the start of our video, Trowbridge is the county town of Wiltshire, the seat of the county council, and it took on the role in 1889, the year that this building was opened, because of its location relative to the county's two largest settlements. Trowbridge was chosen as the place where the county council would meet because it allowed representatives from both Swindon and Salisbury, on opposite sides of Wiltshire, to make the trip here and back home within a day. Just down beside the town hall, meanwhile, is another Victorian-era landmark in the form of Trowbridge's Market Hall, opened in 1861, when it was built with funding from a wealthy local cloth maker who wanted to get the old street market under cover, making it a more pleasant venue for commerce, and where products on sale weren't vulnerable to the elements as they were on the marketplace. As we can see today though, the market hall is no longer in use, and it's actually only the building's facade which remains, as behind it you'll find the town's 1970s Castle Place shopping centre. Similarly, the town hall is soon set to be vacant too, closing for 2 years between 2023 and 2025, as it's set to be refurbished as a major new music venue, home to recording studios where the old town jail cells are located, and a space for performances too. But as we walk around the corner onto Park Road, this won't be the first time that musicians have graced Trowbridge's town hall, as for a long time, the old ballroom was used as a venue for concerts, having played host to a number of famous acts, including The Who and Rod Stewart during the 1960s. The county council moved out of the building in 1974 meanwhile, but it was still used as the local magistrates' court until 2003, while also home to community events and exhibitions on local history. Much of Trowbridge's history is of course indelibly linked to the old cloth trade, but there's a lot more to this town than just that, and here we've walked into one of the most delightful green spaces in town, Trowbridge Park, or as it was originally known, the People's Park. Opened in the late 19th century, this sprawling park is home to everything from beautiful lawns to a bandstand, a delightful lake and plenty of sports facilities, but it's also here that we find Trowbridge's Grand War Memorial. Unveiled back in 1921, this memorial pays tribute to the local men who lost their lives in the First World War and the Second World War, with just under 400 names inscribed on the plaques at the base of the plinth that's topped by a statue of a British soldier. Now, Trowbridge is not often noted when it comes to the history of the two world wars, but this is a town which deserves a little more credit than it often gets, as during the Second World War, this was one of 4 towns which were chosen as a hub for the top-secret production of one of Britain's greatest weapons during the war, the Supermarine Spitfire. Before the war, Spitfires were mostly manufactured in Southampton on England's south coast, but given Southampton's vulnerability to air raids by German bombers, in 1940 the production of the aircraft was split up and moved to a collection of inland towns: Reading, Newbury, Salisbury and Trowbridge. With its industrial heritage, Trowbridge could count on good facilities and an experienced local population to help build the fighter planes, with 3 makeshift factories dotted around the town centre, playing host to Spitfire production, before a purpose-built facility was built later on in the war on the edge of town. Spitfire production actually continued here in Trowbridge even after the war ended, although the main factory was eventually closed down in the mid-20th century, and replaced with a modern retail park on what is today Bradley Road, just to the south of central Trowbridge. You're no doubt more than aware of the significance of the Spitfire during the Second World War, but it couldn't have had the impact that it did without the dedication and secrecy of the people of Trowbridge, proving an often unsung but fascinating episode in this town's recent history. However, having now made our way away from the People's Park and back out onto the streets of the town centre, we find ourselves on Silver Street, lined with yet more fetching early 20th century buildings which today play host to local shops. Now, we mentioned earlier that Trowbridge's prosperous cloth trade reached its peak in the first few decades of the 19th century, a time when its mills were producing thousands upon thousands of textiles on a grand industrial scale, of course being the reason that it was known as the Manchester of the West. But today there are no textile mills operating in Trowbridge. So what was it that caused the end of this centuries-old industry which brought so much prosperity to the town? Well, to understand, we have to go all the way back to the beginnings of Trowbridge's cloth-making industry, the late 15th and early 16th centuries, or the Clothiers' Century. As English cloth gained popularity in Europe, the product's money-making potential was earmarked by the nation's monarchy, and so major cloth-producing areas, including southwest Wiltshire here, were supported by funding from the government to ensure that they continued exporting their much-prized textiles. However, when it came to the era of the Industrial Revolution, local cloth production was able to go up yet another gear with the advent of greater mechanisation. We mentioned earlier that the opening of the Kennet and Avon Canal to the north of the town centre was a godsend in this regard, as it allowed barges to bring coal to Trowbridge from mines in the nearby Somerset coalfield, and this coal was then used to power ever larger cloth mills around town. These modern mills also began employing mechanised power looms and flying shuttles, machines that allowed for much faster production than simply relying on manual hand-weaving techniques. Although many workers actually resisted the introduction of these machines, with a number of riots taking place in the town centre in support of the Luddite movement against rapidly developing manufacturing technology. Still, the industry continued to grow through the late 18th and early 19th centuries, a period when yet more splendid town landmarks were built by cloth merchants, including this, the elegant Polebarn House, which dates from 1789. Originally serving as a townhouse for the local mill owner, John Clark, this Georgian-era building is much better known today as the Polebarn Hotel, a delightful local hotel that's been making use of this exquisite building since 1978. Now, buildings like the Polebarn show us the extent of local wealth from Trowbridge's industrial peak. But as technology continued to advance through the 19th century, this town's factories were gradually overshadowed by larger and more modern textile mills, particularly in the north of England. And so local cloth production shifted from large-scale manufacturing to focusing more on high-quality textiles on a smaller scale. This remained a bedrock of the local economy well into the 20th century, but the last cloth mill in Trowbridge eventually closed down in 1982. Though, as we've spoken about so much on this walk so far, there's plenty to see in town which celebrates this historic industry. Beyond cloth making, Trowbridge also had a stint as a centre of engineering following the end of the war, and it was also the site of a major pork pie and sausage roll factory until 2008. while the town was also, interestingly, home to a major brewery for nearly 200 years. This brewery was Ushers of Trowbridge, who began operations all the way back in 1824 on Back Street, near to the river Biss, and they developed a huge brewery which produced hundreds of thousands of barrels a year for decades. Now sadly, things came to an end in the year 2000, when Ushers was closed down, and the site of the town centre brewery is now home to a supermarket. But what's most interesting is that much of the old brewery equipment that was used here in Trowbridge was sold off to a rather surprising bidder, the Taedonggang Brewery, which is the national brewery of North Korea. So there's an unusual connection between a totalitarian dictatorship and the beer that was once served in the pubs of this Wiltshire town. Pubs like the White Swan, which is purported to be the very oldest pub in all of Trowbridge, opened back in 1692 and having been serving locals for well over 300 years. But the Storied Tavern is just one of a number of fetching historic buildings that line Church Street here. Just a few doors along, we find Hall House, an eye-catching timber-framed hall which is thought to date from as long ago as the 15th century, making it the oldest non-religious building in town. And the eye-catching history of Church Street doesn't stop there, because a few more doors along from Hall House, we can look towards a row of early Victorian-era buildings, which date from 1842, when they were built as the home of the National School here in Trowbridge. Once upon a time, these buildings were home to a boys' and a girls' school, boys on the left side of the building and girls on the right. By the 1960s, this was still a school, connected to St James's Church across the road, but it was eventually closed down and converted into a row of shops, before being adapted again into some rather lovely houses that remain to this day. The old school buildings are also neighboured just around the corner by a row of historic almshouses, built to provide accommodation to the town's most vulnerable in the late 19th century, and which were established under the guidance of the Reverend John David Hastings, who worked as the rector of St James's Church for nearly 30 years. St James's is of course the striking parish church that we saw earlier just off the marketplace, and here we're looking across its spacious churchyard from the other side of the building, with the sun just obscured by its soaring spire. But sadly, it's here that we've now come to the end of our walk around Trowbridge, a fascinating town with a wealth of history, home to an array of grand townhouses, historic halls, towering municipal buildings and much more, while also home to plenty of fascinating stories, ranging from its famed status as one of southwest England's great cloth-making towns, to its secret role as a hub of wartime aeroplane production. Thank you so much for watching this video. I really hope you enjoyed it, and I hope you're looking forward to making a visit to Trowbridge, the Manchester of the West, for yourself sometime soon.